Welcome everyone. It is my great pleasure to open today the CCNB seminar series for the summer term 2025. Today we are having a kind of an introductory session or like a kick-off session for the talks on the topic of control. And also going to hear about the different aspects and facets of control. And I'm happy to hand over to David and Sören.
Yeah, thank you, Timo, for the introduction. And pleased to open the lecture series with our talk today. And as you can see, I'm going to speak about elements of control in human affective neuroscience. Sören's and my talk is structured into 4 parts, so I will start out with a bit of framework, then we'll have 2 focus sessions on different elements of control, and I will then close with the integration of these 2 elements. So control can be understood as executing actions to change aspects of the state or structure of the world and thereby achieve desired outcomes. And to give you an example, you can imagine standing at a street crossing and you have some desired outcomes. So for instance, you would like to visit a friend in the 2nd floor of that apartment. So in this example, you imagine being in this state of the world and you want to reach that state of the world. And in order to do so, you can execute a series of actions. So for instance, as a first step, you can cross the street, quite simple. Then you could walk further down the street, but it's not very suitable for reaching a goal. So instead you decide to cross the street and you reach another intermediate state. You walk a bit to the door, ring the bell, and walk up the stairs and reach your final outcome. Now, with control theory, we can formalize tasks like this and many other tasks. So as you've just seen, we can conceptualize an environment as a set of different states, and you can imagine being in one initial state, and perhaps there's some state with some desired outcome, and then you can take a couple of actions to transition between states. And in order to select these actions, when there are different actions to choose from, you can follow certain policies. Finally, you can perhaps reach some desired outcome in itself, or as you just saw with the street crossing example, you can perhaps reach some intermediate state from where some desired outcome is more easily obtained. Now, importantly, once you've executed some action and you reached some outcome, you can learn from that. So the value of an action can increase when you reach some desired outcome, or perhaps it decreases when you did not do so. And finally, control can also generalize. So imagine a small child learning how to cross a street. So parents tell the child, okay, look left and right, that there's a car coming. And they learn that at a specific street crossing, but they can generalize. So they can also cross other streets that maybe look a bit different, but share the same structural features, and so on. Now, to give you a different example, you can imagine being in an environment, in a mathematics environment, and be in a state where you should prove a mathematical theorem. So for instance, this simple theorem that the square root of 2 is rational. Now, in order to do so, you can follow some step-by-step procedure. So you can first make a choice for proof by contradiction, and you formalize this theorem or a contradiction to the theorem in this way. And then you follow a couple of intermediate steps, square both sides, arrive at some intermediate conclusion, and so on until you arrive at a contradiction. And this tells you that there's a final conclusion, you have a contradiction, so from that you conclude that the theorem must in fact hold. Now, standing here, I have to admit that I created this using ChatGPT, because if any of you had decided to put me into this position, I would not have had a single choice but doing nothing. Because I don't have very high math abilities, and also standing here and talking about it, you notice that I'm aware of that low ability. So, whoops, sorry. There we go. So aside from control theory, which allows us to capture the objective facets of executing control, there is another layer to it, which we are interested in. So people tend to have beliefs about control that they can execute. And we like to think of these, this layer as consisting perhaps of 4 different elements. So human affective neuroscience in recent years has focused on one element, which is choice availability. So people believing whether or not to have a choice and studying whether this is linked to some kind of effective value, for instance. The second element that I'm going to go into more detail into today is internal causation. So people have beliefs whether their actions causally elicit desired outcomes or whether they don't. The third element is metacognition and metacontrol. So as I'm trying to reach certain outcomes, I'm keeping track of my own cognitive processes that through which I try to reach my goals, and I assess the quality of those processes, and I try to make a prediction via, for instance, subjective feelings of confidence that arise through metacognition of whether my actions will actually be successful. And metacognition is closely linked to metacontrol. And for instance, metacontrol allows us to change certain policies that guide how we select between actions. Now, the fourth element that we are also going to speak about today is again generalization. So perhaps when I'm taking a math course and I get a bad grade, this informs my math ability belief, but also maybe it informs, because it's quite similar, my belief about physics ability, where I also have to deal with equations and stuff like that. But this bad math exam will likely not inform my beliefs about sports. So these are four elements that we like to think of today. Also talking about having low ability in something is also somehow emotional. So there are some effective corollaries to these things. And one is that certain motivational states are linked to executing control and choosing between actions. There's something like emotional experience, which we're going to hear more about today. So the outcomes we obtain and the way in which we obtain certain outcomes is relevant for emotional experience. And having certain ability beliefs, maybe being capable of solving different tasks and various domains of behaviors linked to such things as self-esteem. So, you know this lecture series, so I'm just going to use this slide to give you a short preview, which you can also find in more detail online. So on May 19th, we are happy to invite Mauricio Delgado, who will speak about perceived control and links to emotional regulation. Then on June 2nd, Sophie Bavaro will join us, and she will talk about a hierarchy of metacognitive capabilities. So from local metacognition with regard to specific tasks, and also metacognition regarding global domains of behavior. Now, Lillian Weber will join us to speak about emotional decision-making, and I think she's got some very nice studies using ultrasound stimulation and high-resolution fMRI. And Steve Fleming will then give a talk on June 23rd about metacognitive control of information seeking. The second to last talk, we're happy to invite Yadneev, and she will speak about causal inference, which is close to the internal causation thing. Just take this as a rough embedding. It's maybe the speakers would object to where I've placed them, but we'll see. And finally, Patrick Haggard will join us here on site. All the other talks are hybrid. He will join us here on site to speak about the sense of agency, which you might not be aware of. Okay, having said this, I would now go to the first focus part. And this is work from my PhD that, from a couple of years ago, where we were interested in achievement-related pride. So, as I just said, one key element of control is having a choice. And there's some work by Lauren Laerty and colleagues who were interested in the value of having choices. And in order to isolate this, like having a choice or not, independent of what follows, they actually used so-called mere choice tasks, where people had a choice between different things, but this choice was completely isolated from the rewards or non-rewards that followed. So to explain this a bit better, you can think of a game of roulette, where you can place your bet on red or black, and then the wheel is spun, and after a while the ball lands in one color, and you win or you lose. But there is no inherent connection between your choice and whether you win or lose. Now, in contrast to this, as I said, internal causation is another key facet, and classical psychological theory tells us that beliefs about being a causal agent is very relevant for concepts like self-efficacy, for instance. So here, in contrast to the studies above, it's interesting that people actually think their actions are causally effective. And here you can think of a game of darts, where you try to aim well with the dart and you throw it, and maybe you've practiced a lot in the past, and then you hit the target you aimed for, so for example, bullseye. And with all the things that have been going on, this outcome is somehow informative about the quality of the actions you chose to do or you executed. So thereby, this outcome becomes self-relevant. And this is something that Sören and I think about a lot in our work. So, as you may know, causality or beliefs about causality are also a very big topic in psychological emotion theory. So very classically, appraisal theory has talked about attributions to external versus external outcomes and has said that this is important for emotional experience. And a bit more recently, causal inference has also been linked to topics like emotional control. Now, through this self-relevance, we can start to talk about self-conscious emotions. And these cover, for example, pride or embarrassment or shame, and rely on active self-representations. So in contrast to basic emotions like happiness or sadness, when you experience pride or you're ashamed of something, you have some representation of your own person or of aspects of your own person. So when we observe, for instance, some positive event and we engage in causal inference, and we attribute this positive event to some external factors like chance, we can experience most likely happiness. And there's been some work in affective neuroscience a while ago where Rutledge and colleagues investigated how randomly rising wins and losses in gambles affect our momentary happiness. In contrast, when we attribute a positive event, for instance, to our own efforts or something like in the darts example, we can experience achievement-related pride. And there's also been some work on this, even a bit longer ago, and where Takahashi and colleagues put people in the scanner and asked them to imagine being like winning a golf championship or something. Now, when we thought about all this, we thought that it would be nice to have people inside the scanner and not imagine being in pride-associated situations, but to actually perform some task where either they have some sense of causal effectiveness over the outcome or where they do not. So on each trial of these tasks, of this experiment, people saw a checkerboard pattern like this. And as you can see, half of the squares are yellowish and the other half are bluish, and they're all kind of different brightness. Now, we had two experimental conditions that I'm going to speak about today. And one was called color, and we call it the medium control condition. And here people, like in the game of roulette, were simply asked to select a square of a color. For instance, they should place that on blue by clicking blue square, and then they were told they can either win a small amount of money or they won't. And they did so on 50% of trials. They won or they didn't on the other half. Now, in the high control condition, we told people to identify the brightest blue square, for instance, or on other trials, the brightest yellow square. And as you can see, there were always some squares that were almost identically bright. So people could not really be sure whether they had actually identified the brightest square. But they were told that if they succeeded to do so, they would then win a small amount of money. And if they did not succeed, they would not. And because the task was designed in a way that there were always some options that could also be true, this allowed us to manipulate feedback and to keep it equivalent to the medium control condition. So here, in 3 studies, we saw in the post-experimental interviews that people experienced a lot more control in the high control and the medium control condition, which is basically what we wanted to see, and to then test how this impacts momentary emotional experience, we collected ratings of happiness and pride on a subset of trials. Now, when we look at the results, what we see is that in the medium control condition, you see happiness is red, pride is blue. We see that win outcomes lead to more positive effect than no-win outcomes. So far, so good. If we now, however, also look at the high control condition, what we see is that the difference in positive effect between win and no-win outcomes increases more strongly for pride than it does for happiness as compared to the median control condition. So what this tells us is that the experience of self-conscious positive effect or self-evaluative positive effect of pride is driven more strongly by changes in controllability than is the case by happiness. And we could also replicate this in a second study, and for only the pride ratings, we also found an interaction in a fifth study that we did. Now, what we were also interested in was to look at the neural activity that goes along with these emotional experiences of these task effects. And we were here interested in two sets of brain regions. So you may know that there's various brain regions, maybe along the cortical midline, including posterior cingulate cortex and medial prefrontal cortex, that are associated with self-referential processing. So for instance, when I think about my own personality characteristics, as opposed to thinking about somebody else's characteristics, we would typically find that activity in these brain regions tend to be increased. Now, another set of brain regions is the so-called valuation system, which I'm sure you've heard of, and this mainly includes the ventral striatum and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and is involved in processes like tracking reward prediction errors or reward anticipation, and is therefore linked to processing affective value. And as you can see, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is part of both of these systems. So basically, our reasoning was that this region could be particularly important for processing when people reach desired outcomes and believe that they are due to their own actions. So we turned to neurosynth, where you can run automated meta-analyses on fMRI studies, and we created 3 masks. One was covered brain regions associated with the term self-referential but not value. Another one covered brain regions associated with the term value but not self-referential. And a third one, the self and value mask, included the VMPFC, which you can see shows just this, that these voxels, if you wish, are associated with both these terms. So when we look at the main effects of the study, we see that when people obtained wins versus no wins, we saw robust activation in the valuation system. And for the orthogonal contrast, we see that observing outcomes that you can attribute to your own actions, as opposed to those where it is not the case, the median control condition, we see in these bluish colors increased activation along the cortical midline. Now, what we also did was we checked for particular increases for desired outcomes that you could attribute to your own actions, which were associated with the strongest pride. And what we see here is, in fact, that as expected, we see the ventral medial prefrontal cortex seems to play a particular role here for integrating the effective value of the outcome and the information regarding how you obtained that outcome. So up to here, what we've seen is that positive effect depends not only on the value of outcomes, but also depends on the causes you infer for these outcomes. And these internal control beliefs are very important for self-evaluation on a local level. So with regard to specific moments, it matters whether you believe that you are the cause of what you observe in the world. And this is also tracked on the level of the brain and ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Now, in the next part, Sören will go beyond this a bit. And so he will talk about control beliefs on a more global level. And as you will see next, we will discuss how experience of control in a certain way, or feedback about succeeding at certain tasks in particular moments, can contribute to more generalized beliefs about control regarding certain domains. So by this, I hand over to him.
Okay, it's the first time we did this. We are doing this talk together, so let's see how it works. First of all, thanks again also from my side, Timo and Felix, that we have the opportunity to do this lecture series, CCNB's lecture series together with you. And we're very happy to do so. Okay, I'm now jumping to a second branch of research that we do in our lab, which is related to the formation of self-beliefs or the formation of ability beliefs and the generalization. And when we look at the term self-belief, we look it up in the internet, we find a lot of information, for example, that it's a superpower and that it's important not to have negative self-beliefs because this is detrimental for personal health. That self-beliefs are essential for career success, etc. And in our lab, we are interested in the question of how we arrive at these self-beliefs. So irrespective, mainly from the performance, we are interested, how do people arrive at the belief, for example, that one is sporty, athletic, that one is healthy, or that I'm like a social person, or for example, that I consider myself female or male. So on the level of ability, body, or identity, how do people arrive there? And this question is quite difficult to answer, especially in an experimental setup, because as you can see here on this picture, every current belief that a person has about him or herself is rooted in a long history of information, of learning, of experiences, and so on. So this makes it quite difficult to study how people arrive at a certain belief at one certain point. And to illustrate this, I have this question for you. So, for example, how strong would you consider your football ability compared to some 500 or 1,000 random people? And this is a question every one of you could probably answer. But if you ask this guy, Harry Kane, he would be probably quite sure about his ability. He's one of the best football players in the world. He's better than 99.9%, and he's quite sure about it. So if you sample, let's say, 1,000 people or 500 people, there's some football players playing in the Champions League. They're on the highest level. And then there are other players. So I'm like slightly above 50. I would say I play every second Sunday. So I'm okay. I'm relative to most people. I would say I'm better than 50%. Of course, there's a huge difference to the football players in the Bundesliga. But I would say I'm better than random people, and David is not playing football, so he would consider his ability on the lower end, probably. What is interesting is if you ask about the certainty or the confidence in this belief, here you would say Harry is very confident that he's one of the best players in the world. I'm also confident that I'm better than like the average person on the street and playing football, because I do it regularly. And David would also be very confident that he's not really good. And this makes it quite difficult to study how people arrive there, because they're already very confident in this belief and this football, sport, athletic belief, and they have a high confidence in it. But what happens if you ask Harry Kane, for example, the question, how good are you in estimating the amount of crown caps? And so we did this, not really, we found this on the internet, and I hope it's working. You can hear it. Oh, no. And try.
QuickTime is not available. No.
No.
Okay, damn, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work on your computer. I thought you tried it. Okay. Sorry. So too bad. So, okay, I have to reveal it now. So Harry Kane is saying he's not really good at this stuff like this. So, and compared to other players in his football team, usually, I mean, the video is really nice. Everyone is passing by and giving some estimations. Everyone is like really not confident in this ability, and everyone has like a very low ability or like an average ability. And this makes it interesting for us to use this task, the estimation of crown caps, as an experimental setup to study how people arrive at a certain belief. So the idea of this task is that we can construct an artificial belief. Here, the artificial belief of I'm good or bad in estimating the amount of crown caps. Because, as you could see in this simulation here, on this simulated data, most of them do not have like a very high level. Nobody is saying, okay, I'm better than 99% in estimating the amount of crown caps. But also nobody is saying, okay, I'm the worst. I'm just better than 1%. and also the confidence is rather low. So this makes it interesting for us to use this paradigm to study how people arrive at a certain belief. And what is also interesting is that you can use this paradigm in a repetitive version. And I will show how this works. So we are not doing, obviously, we're not doing the amount of crown caps and not in a jar, this example, but we have different estimation categories, which we ask participants to estimate. For example, the height of houses and the weight of animals. And at the beginning of this task, usually participants, university students, they have the conviction of the idea of themselves as, I don't know, like somewhere in the middle, better than, let's say, 45%. And then we are letting them estimate, for example, the property of this house, of this castle, and then we give a targeted faked feedback to make them somehow build across or over like 20, 25 trials an ability belief that they are rather good in estimating the height of houses. So we are, unknowing to the participants, we are coupling their estimation performance with a faked feedback and make them believe that they're good in this category. At the same time, we have the other category, which is estimating the weight of animals, which we rather couple with negative feedback. And over 20 trials, again, we make them believe that they're rather bad in this ability of estimating the weight of animals. And what is nice for us is that everyone is starting more or less in the middle with a more neutral conviction, not with a very high or very extreme level. But then after the course of processing some of the feedbacks related to their own performance in the estimation task, at the end or after 20 trials, they have established two levels. One, that they're rather good in estimating the heights of different houses, but the other rather bad in estimating the weights of different animals. And this conviction is much more precise at the end after 20 trials. So they're more strongly convinced that they're really good or bad. So this is the task structure of the learning of own performance task, the loop task that we are using in our lab. We have not only the agent self, so we are not only focusing on how people form these beliefs about themselves, but we are also interested in how people develop a belief or model a belief about another person. This is the other condition. So we also have another person sitting in another room, and then the participants are observing the estimation performance and the feedback of the other person. And via trial by trial, they are building or updating a model about this other person's ability. So in principle, it works like this. At the very beginning, there's a cue indicating, okay, now it's about estimating height of houses or weights of animals or amounts of crown caps in a jar or distances between two vehicles. And whether it's about you or the other person in the other room, then for every trial, we ask participants to give an expectation of what they think, how good they are in this task. Then they do the estimation task of estimating the height of this house, for example, and then we give a targeted controlled prediction error, controlled feedback, I have to say. And so depending on the feedback and the expectation, there is the so-called prediction error, which is then used together with the learning rate to see how participants use this information to update from one trial to the next trial. And across all our tasks, we compared different computational models, but the winning model that was winning in every study that we conducted was a computational model with 4 learning rates. So two for the self condition, and two learning rates for the other condition, and both for positive and negative prediction errors. And these are now used for subsequent analyses. So now I'm presenting 2 studies out of several studies, more or less 6, 7 studies. I'm just presenting 2 fundamental studies to show how this is implemented and that it's working. So this is the first study by Laura Müller-Pinzler from our lab, where she made participants learn this information about themselves. So it worked. We could see that these participants at the end of 25 trials had the impression that they are good in this one category and rather bad in the other category. And interestingly, when we look at the learning rates, we see that participants rather update from negative prediction. So they have a stronger update from the prior to the subsequent expectation after negative prediction errors. And this negativity bias for self-related learning, or valence bias, we find across all our studies. So we repeatedly found this negativity bias in all our studies. And then we also made participants learn this information about the other person. So we replicated mainly the same. So participants also learn this information about the other person. They are good in one and rather bad in the other category. But here we do not see this valence bias. So participants use the information about the other person to a similar degree. So there is no valence bias when participants learn about the other person. In the second study, we translated this paradigm, the learning of own performance task, to the MRI. So as you can see here, one person in the scanner, another person sitting outside, that is observed by the person in the scanner. And then what you could do, or what we were interested in studying, was how participants process those prediction errors, or the feedback in the scanner while doing the task. And there you can distinguish two types of prediction errors. One is the surprise prediction error, which is like the absolute magnitude of the prediction error. So the higher your surprise, no question. So the absolute amount, or the absolute magnitude of the prediction, which could be in a negative or in a positive direction. So just what is associated on the level of the brain with higher surprise, you could say. And here we find a correlation or association with structures of the salience network, that's coding arousal, but also for value representation in the medial prefrontal cortex. And interestingly, this works out for learning about the self and about the other person to a similar degree. So if you're surprised about the big prediction error of the other person that the other person is receiving, then you also have this association with these networks. The other prediction error that we can code is the valence prediction error, which is like the positivity or the negativity of a prediction error. And here we see that this is only relevant for the self. So maybe this is too much to say, but there is only an association of the valence prediction error with activation in the nucleus accumbens, which is involved in reward anticipation or reward processing. And here we only see this association when participants process the more positive prediction errors for themselves, but this is not found when we look at how participants observe those valence prediction errors about the other person. And this is replicating or similar to the behavioral finding that we see this valence bias only for the self and not for the other person. So this brings me to the interim summary 2, and then I'm handing over to David again. So we are interested in studying the formation of self-beliefs, and I hope I could somehow show that it's difficult to approach this question, how people arrive at certain ability beliefs, but with the idea of constructing artificial beliefs, this is possible somehow, because you somehow deconstruct this very fixed initial belief and the confidence or certainty that usually people have if you study, let's say, mathematics, sports, music. Everyone has a very established self-belief already, but deconstructing this into the domain of artificial beliefs like estimation of weights of animals, you can study how people arrive at a certain belief. And the broader relevance, we are both at the Department of Psychiatry at Lübeck University, so we are interested also in how this is affected in clinical conditions such as depression, who are known to have very maladaptive, negative self-beliefs about themselves and very rigid, and which is difficult to make them change. And therefore, for us, it's very interesting to study how people arrive there and also how you can break this and make them unlearn something that they have already learned about themselves. So this, I'm finished. And
okay, sorry. maybe it was a bit quick and you still want to say something? Okay. All right. So as I said, I will now try to integrate these two elements that we've just talked about. And what we've learned so far is that causal inferences about certain outcomes can drive our affective experience in a particular moment or locally. And as Sören has just told you, such feedback in particular situations can also contribute to more global beliefs about ourselves or about the degree of control that we experience in certain behavioral domains. Now, two questions that I would now like to talk about a bit more is how causal inference impacts the formation of ability beliefs, and whether there are certain quantities that contribute to causal inferences. And in a recent study that we did, we again used this loop task with a small tweak. And this is that we again, as before, had certain estimation categories, and we only had a single person learning about their own ability, so there was no other person. So for instance, this person learned about weights, so weights of animals or the heights of buildings, and there were also two other categories. And the tweak was that on each trial of the task, during the queue, they were informed whether the feedback they obtained was potentially manipulated by a hidden agent for the name. And in other conditions, this was not the case. So people knew, okay, I'm now doing the task, but the feedback will be valid, so it will represent my performance. And in these agent conditions, in the end, we asked people whether they actually believed that the feedback had been manipulated or not. So the study was designed in this way. We had 4 estimation categories, and 2 were linked with primarily positive feedback and 2 with primarily negative feedback. And there were 2 estimation categories where no manipulation was possible, and in 2 others, this was the case. So we had one benevolent agent in the high ability condition. So here people knew when they performed a task and their feedback that possibly the benevolent agent made the feedback better than it actually was. And the opposite with an evil agent held for the low ability condition. So when we now look at the learning trajectories, we see that in the dark colors where no agent could intervene, people again formed some beliefs about their own ability, particularly here in the negative condition, whereas this learning or the formation of this belief was a bit weaker maybe. But in stark contrast to this, we see that when the manipulation was possible, this learning was strongly attenuated. So as before, we again fit Rescaler-Wagner type learning models to these data. And as I told you, we always find this negativity bias in learning, which we find again here. And the model was adapted in a certain way, so it included a shrink factor. So this basically worked in a way that anytime for any trial where people indicated that they thought the agent manipulated the feedback, the learning rates were shrunk by a certain amount. So on average, you see that learning only occurs at 50% of the rate when an intervention was assumed than when this was not the case. What we also looked here was these, aside from these model parameters, was how people attributed or which causal inferences people made. And what we see here is that people actually show some kind of self-serving bias. So they tend to make more external attributions following negative prediction errors and a bit more internal attributions following positive prediction errors. And as I said initially, we're always interested in the effective corollaries of these processes. So when we've seen before that causal inference is related to momentary positive effect, we here see that these biases relate to self-esteem, so some kind of global self-evaluation. And we see that with higher self-esteem, people tend to have less negative learning bias, and they also tend to show an even more positive or more self-serving attribution bias. Now, in a very similar study, Zamfir and Dayan had people run through digital mazes or virtual mazes that were displayed on the screen. And across different trials, these mazes could be rather simple with short routes or could have longer routes with more walls in between, and so on. And within each trial, it was also possible that the orientation of these mazes unexpectedly switched by 90 or 180 degrees and so on. So people had to use the key presses navigate through the maze, and then maybe the orientation switched, and they had to rethink, okay, in which direction am I walking now? And they had a certain amount of time to complete each maze. So at the end of each trial, they actually received performance feedback indicating whether they arrived with the small red square at the target or whether they didn't. And after this feedback, they also had to make some causal attributions. So they were asked to pick the main cause of the outcome they had just observed. And as you can see, they could, for instance, say, well, I succeeded because the maze was so simple, because there were few rotations, because I was lucky, or because I have high ability. And also they were asked, similar to our own study, to indicate on each trial what they thought their ability in this task was right now. And this study includes a lot of computational modeling stuff that I'm not going to go into today, but I'm really only focusing on some key results that parallel our own quite neatly. And what we see is that following winner outcomes, people tend to show positive belief updates or skill belief updates, and following negative feedback, the opposite holds, which is not so surprising. And similar to our own study, what we see is that this learning is diminished following external attributions than internal attributions. So they show diminished positive belief updates for wins and diminished negative belief updates for losses when they attribute outcomes to the maze or the number of rotations and so on. And while this study could not show that self-esteem is linked to the way people update or learn from feedback, it could show that the average skill estimate is related to self-esteem. Now, the other question I wanted to address was how these causal inferences actually arise. So in this study, the authors also tested for this. And as you can see here, for instance, when trials had more orientations in the task, people more strongly attributed losses to the rotations, whereas I think they didn't find an effect for wins. However, here it's more accentuated. So with mazes that were particularly long, people tended to attribute losses to the length of the maze, and wins were less likely attributed to the maze. Oops. Then you also see a similar pattern for luck, and here with the number of correct key presses, so people appear to keep track of how often they pressed the correct button, or whether they ran in the wrong direction or against some wall or something. And keeping track of this quantity in their head actually predicted the attributions they made for wins and losses. And finally, what they also tested was whether the previous skill estimate predicts these causal inferences. And what we see here is that when I currently believe that I'm rather skilled at this task, I tend to attribute wins to myself. Sorry, the green line. But I tend to less attribute losses to my own behavior or my own ability. And here we can also see that this is correlated with self-esteem, similar to our work. So what we see is that these two elements of control are somehow reciprocally related, in that the beliefs we have about our own abilities impact what we think, how we think the world arises, if you wish. It sounds a bit weird, but how the outcomes arise that we observe in the world. And also this has an impact on beliefs regarding ability. Oops, wrong. So to conclude, we've seen some different elements of control or elements of beliefs about control. That is choice, the other three that I mentioned earlier. And aside from what we've talked about today, there's a lot more literature regarding all these elements, and also in just the past years, there's a lot of work trying to connect these different elements. So while we've seen today that what experienced control does with emotional experience at a certain moment in time, and while we've also seen how these experiences of control contribute to more global beliefs about control, there's also work that we've also partially seen today, is how beliefs about control contribute to control expectations. And what I find very interesting is, and what I think Sophie might talk a bit more about, is how local metacognition, so computations of confidence in metacognitive processing, can kind of substitute for external feedback on our performance. So when we build some belief about whether we succeed to solve a task or not, this can contribute to our ability beliefs. And also the other way around, this is possible. So yeah, by this I would conclude. I think maybe we can talk about some clinical implications of these processes if there's interest to this. And otherwise, I'm better on time than I expected. And thank you all for your attention.